Monday likes to spend their summer holiday down beside the side of the silvery.
Perhaps it's because I was born on the east coast, within earshot of the waves breaking on those shingle beaches on stormy nights, and always with the friendly flash of the lighthouse visible through the bedroom curtains, that my idea of a day out is a day at the seaside. There's been a song about it, and it's been around a long time. Oh, I Do Like to Be Beside the Seaside dates back to music hall performer Mark Sheridan, who recorded it in 1909. It was also recorded by another music hall favourite, Florrie Forde, and the song was part of a visit by the family to the seaside when I was a child. I suppose that was the hangover from the Edwardian enthusiasm for the British seaside, which peaked in the 30s with a post-war boom through the 1950s and 60s, although by then many large seaside towns had already seen their best days. But my summer holidays were day trips, mostly to places like Felixstowe or Lowestoft, Great Yarmouth, even Clacton if we fancied a longer journey. And of course, even though almost every part of our coast is different, it's all tied together by the sea that surrounds us. And I think it's got a collective spirit of place, genius loci. It's that aggregation of landscape, buildings, history, sounds, smells, people, even food that conjures a recognition and affection, and it takes us back to the seaside time and again. As a child of England's Suffolk coast, I find the crash of waves soothing, and even the screech of herring gulls evokes days of happiness. But everywhere has different values, and North Yorkshire's coast, where they have cliffs and steep-sided harbours and wide sandy beaches, is wilder, but it's no warmer, of course, than Suffolk. But it's one of the places where the seaside of piers, amusement arcades, coastal parks, big seaside hotels and theatres began. Drop down to the south coast and Poole Harbour and Studland are now homes to the rich and famous, with £1 million houses along sandbanks, but it's still the seaside, and very beautiful too in parts. Somerset, with its rocky north coast, has a slightly faded magnificence and earnest attempts to restore the glory days of the past in resorts like Ilfracombe and Minehead have only been partly effective, but all that faded grandeur has a charm of its own. Every seaside is different, but all of it calls to us. With a handful of exceptions like sandbanks and posh coastal villages such as Abersoch on the Llŷn Peninsula, the seaside is not, on average, a rich place. Work is seasonal and poorly paid, and the stock of hotels and boarding houses needs renovation. Local authorities constantly dither between investing in tourism and saving ratepayers' money. And the most recent research says the seaside as a whole has a poorer health than most of the rest of the country. Now that may be because the seaside, by definition, is on the edge and not at the heart of things. There are few thrusting modern cities or rich and comfortable market towns demanding political attention with their votes. And yet it is, as I have always known, I suppose, good for us. Research by Plymouth University confirms that we really do like to be beside the seaside. They say coastal visits generate particularly high levels of satisfaction, feelings of calm, pleasure, health and appreciation, compared with visits to the countryside or open spaces in general. It's on the edge of our country. The seaside is a battleground, not just between the sea and the land, demanding expensive sea defences, but against waves of incoming sewage from uncontrolled private water companies, and conflict between the livelihoods of locals and the demands of rich incomers in some places. But all of that conflict fades for most visitors because the seaside is still day trips and holidays. We enjoy the food, pasties, fudge, ice cream, the thinly sliced cafe ham, egg and chips of my childhood, but mostly and always, of course, proper fish and chips. And then there's the amusements and sometimes the fairground, as well as the municipal gardens and piers. There's the beach, although none are the same. And then there's the weather. In the end, the weather doesn't really matter as you meander on the edge of the waves, or at least in the winter out of the reach of the salt sea spray. It's at its very best with kids, of course, to take on donkey rides, eat candy floss and watch Punch and Judy. Cultural heritage, I suppose. And they see the rocks, the sand, the waves, the pebbles with fresh new eyes. And the seaside shop is a treasure trove to them, even though it's full of tat. The spades and buckets that break almost before you buy them. The kites that don't fly, inflatable things, pointless souvenirs, seashells, sometimes even snow globes, all wonderfully distinct and eccentric British rubbish, even if it's manufactured in China. In fact, the only really unpleasant thing about the seaside is the car parking, and nowhere is without some bastard pay and display machine charging London prices. It's just mean-spirited. The British seaside now is a museum to mass tourism over the past century or more. Some places have carved a niche for themselves within that format, like Southwold with its eccentric pier, the riverside fish cafes and tarred fisherman's hut, an annual arts festival. And then there are seaside villages like Abersoch and others on Cardigan Bay, which have become holiday havens for the exceptionally well-heeled. Their multitude of trendy, expensive restaurants, specialist sportswear shops and the inevitable yacht club remind me of my home village of Orford on the Suffolk coast, which has become little more than a suburb of Kensington or Richmond. But most places just keep plodding on, buoyed up as they have been for many decades by the working people staying in the massive static caravan parks sprawling along the coast, or the apartments created out of the very same boarding houses their grandparents stayed in nearly a century earlier. Sometimes this less successful seaside is slightly run down, the poverty of marginal places again with marginal work and few prospects. And a handful, sadly, have been tipped over the edge into a wasteland, becoming a dumping ground for the vulnerable and inadequate people nowhere else will accept, the addicts and drunks who now populate the B&Bs and cheap hotels. And of course nobody else wants to go there, and that is how the seaside dies. There are more on their way up, albeit slowly. In places like Ilfracombe, Minehead and Poole you can see the investment in facilities and the beginnings of change. Still more continue to thrive because of their own unique combination of attractions. Whitby is a prime example with its harbour, its abbey, the narrow streets of shops selling jet and amber, to say nothing of the goth and Dracula trade, and the fishing port and the restaurants. Now, of course, the whole seaside is on offer, not just the towns with a railhead as it has been in the past, and the coast between the seaside towns and villages is better protected than it has been in some many decades, thanks to the National Trust looking after key spots like Brean Down and long sections of coast, and other landowners realising the potential of their particular stretches of cliff or beach. But the COVID pandemic made it clear it's neither necessary nor desirable for us to crowd into large, overpriced cities and suburbs. Many can work from where we choose, and we would choose surely the places that have drawn us to them as places of leisure and enjoyment for nearly a century and a half. So I hope that's the future for the seaside. The migration of the workers that used to happen once a year when the factory closed for the holidays might become a permanent dispersal, bringing people and wealth to the seaside. Whether it happens or not, my idea of a proper holiday, even a day out, will remain a visit to the seaside.
Upon the from, where the brass band plays the